There we go. Today's session. So this is another webinar in the series for rural health clinics in Montana. Today we have the speaker, Ralph Lewellyn, who's a partner with Eide, and we'll be covering Montana rural health clinics beyond the caps. And let me make you host. And there you go. Should be good.
All right. Can you see the presentation slides right now?
Yeah,
we can.
Oh, perfect. All right. Well, let's get rolling then. Well, good afternoon. Greatly appreciate the opportunity to have a visit about what's going on in rural health clinics. Lots of activity going on out there, and a lot of things that we need to maybe step back and relook at how we operate these monsters going forward. There have always been some challenges along the way, and now there's just some new ones, and at the same time, there's some new opportunities. So we'll just get rolling on in that discussion. So a little bit of my background for those that don't know me. My name is Ralph Lewellyn, and I am the partner in charge of critical access hospital services and the consulting services, the healthcare consulting services that we do at Eide for all provider types, be it nursing homes, home health, hospice, rural health clinics, etc. So by background, I started out as a hospital CFO in the 90s, spent a little time as a hospital CFO in that role. For the last 26 years, I've been working with rural providers predominantly on various rural reimbursement operating issues. So let's talk about what's been going on in this area of rural health clinics. You know, when we think about the last 2 years, there's been a lot of discussion about the caps. Unfortunately, there's been, little conversation, I believe, on, how this may potentially impact the strategies. I mean, there's this issue about not liking the caps, how they're going to work and all that there, but not as much on what is it going to mean to my clinic? How's that going to change that? So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about what these changes are and, how they may impact an organization or things you may want to do to impact your organization. So we'll start by confirming our understanding of the per visit caps. We're not going to spend a lot of time there. As I indicated, the last couple of years have predominantly been spent looking at that piece. But then we're going to discuss, updated strategies that RHCs are looking at or may want to look at. Some of these are things that we've already been seeing. So we'll talk about different scenarios we've seen in the market. So it's not just a hypothetical, this could happen, that could happen. Some of these are things that we've actually ran into, which may not have been the intention of the program, but are definitely the ways that it's impacting providers. So let's talk about the payment change first of all. So all of this came in December of 2020. For the most part, for a lot of the industry, I would say that this was an unknown. No one knew it was really coming. And so what it did is it increased the payment limit for freestanding RHCs and provider-based, if you're provider-based to a hospital in greater than 50 beds. And so this is the side of the bill or the law that I think everyone for the most part would say is the part that really made a lot of sense. Because prior to this, the independents, the freestandings, as well as those that were over 50 beds, they were getting a per visit rate of around 80 some bucks a visit. And when you're looking at something that's there to provide access, it really had fallen behind the times. And the payment for a lot of those RHCs really wasn't a whole lot different than what they'd give if they were just a freestanding clinic. So it really wasn't giving a benefit. So effective April 1st of 2021, there's going to be an 8-year period where they're going to increase these costs per visit. Instead of increasing them by 1 or 2%, they're going to start jumping them by approximately 13 bucks a year. So on the front end, I'll show you a table here in just a second. It's about a 13% increase per year on the front end. By the time we get into the later parts of the 2020s, we'll start to see that's probably closer to about a 6-7% increase. But at the same time, it's always a much larger increase than what we had seen prior. After 2028, then it's going to update based on the Medicare Economic Index. And we're going to talk about what's good and bad about that, mostly bad, where the challenges potentially are down the road. So here's the change in the fee schedule. So you can see that the way that the setup was is when it first started, the program started, or before this bill started, effective January 1st of 2021, the rate was going to be at $87.52. Well, this changed that. This changed it and said on April 1st, we're going to go up to $100. Significant increase, over a 13% increase there. And you can see how it's going to bump up $13 a year every year until 2028 when it goes up $12, and then it's going to stop at that $190. Well, obviously, there's a huge difference between $87.52 and $190. After that, it's going to go up by the Medicare Economic Index, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So right now, freestanding, as well as provider-based greater than 50 beds, or new RHCs, even if they are under 50 beds, are going to get paid this cap. So this year, that's $126. Now, if you are a provider based less than 50 beds and you were already in existence, you were grandfathered. And in this grandfathering, you would basically have a rate set on 4/1 of 2021 that was based off of your historical cost reports. So your 2020 cost report, or if you were a new RHC in 2020, it'd be the first rate that you had set from a cost report final settled. And so that's what was going to happen there. So you had to be grandfathered. You either had to be an RHC at 12/31 of 2020, or you had to at least have submitted your application. So that last piece was a way to take those people that were in the process and not penalizing them for this last minute notice. So if you were new after that, then you're going to go back to that fee schedule that I showed you here. So that was the big piece. There's this big push to get everybody in as a grandfathered entity. So here's an example of a non-grandfathered RHC example. So the cost per visit effective this year is $126. If on the cost report, the cost that they come up with is greater than $126, you're going to be limited to the $126 per visit. If the cost per visit was less than $126, then you're going to get the lower amount. So let's say it was $121. If it was $121, that's the amount that would be allowed on the cost report. And then that would go into your final settlement. So it's kind of the greatest amount you're going to get is that limit. If you fall below that limit that year, you are going to get paid the lower. Now next year, they'll recalculate it again with the new limit, which will either be the 126 or now the 139, the 152. Let's say you're provider based. If you're provider based, and let's say your cost per visit in 2020 was $225. Well, each year we talked about that Medicare Economic Index. Well, that Medicare Economic Index is going to come into play here. So they increased it for a couple of years of inflation. So now that 225 becomes 242. So on your cost report for that year, if your cost was greater than $242, that's what you're going to get. But let's say the cost was less than 242, let's say 205. So then what's going to happen there is you're going to get paid the 205. So it's going to be the lower of the two, but you can see how the factor is going to work if you have the new rates or if you have the grandfathered methodology. So two different methodologies that are going to apply depending on if you are a provider based less than 50 beds or the other ones, or if you're a brand new RHC. So here's an example. And this is kind of what we saw in the first year. So you had an interim cap. And what I said is interim cap is because those caps, when you first got them, they were based on the filed cost report. Those caps will be finalized when you get your last finalized cost report for 2020. So that number may change a little bit. So the interim cap was $331.62. Well, one of the first ones we worked with, the actual cost, the actual all-inclusive rate was $371.18. And so the visits that they had for that year for April 1st of 2021 were 335. And so at 335, when they looked at the Medicare reimbursement, that difference in the cost, they were actually limited to $10,605. The issue with this one is it was only one quarter. This was a 6/30 year end. So they only had a partial year impact. So their estimate at their first cost report is that they were going to get limited on an annualized basis of upward of $45,000. which really started that whole conversation of how do we have to operate differently? Because if I can't get all my cost or the majority of my cost out of this RHC, what's that going to do long term? So let's talk about strategies. And again, these are going to be strategies that we've seen other entities utilizing. And so that's kind of the impetus of the whole rest of the conversation. So the one thing that we do know is that the strategies of the past may have been correct in the past, but they may not be the strategies that we can utilize successfully in the future. And so this is where analysis ends up being required, either internally or with whoever you work with on that type of analysis. Sometimes it's going to be changes in the way you operate. Sometimes it might be changes in the way that you report things on the Medicare cost report, because Medicare cost reports are very much like our tax returns, from the aspect that you can make elections of different options of ways to handle things. Now, if you're going to make a change, you're going to want to make sure you understand that there, if there needs to be an approval. And oftentimes, if it's like an allocation methodology change, you're going to have to make a request for approval. And so you're going to need to make sure you work with whoever you work with to do that. Typically, those need to be submitted at least 90 days prior to the end of the cost report year for which you want them to be effective. And the MAC then has 60 days to grant that or deny it. If they do no action on it after 60 days, it's deemed approved. Don't see that too often that they go beyond the 60 days, but I have seen a few where it's went beyond the 60 days and then you have a deemed approval. So let's talk about what we expect to see and what we have been seeing. So we're going to break this a little bit into freestanding and provider-based here, because freestanding RHCs, we expect them to see less challenges as the caps will increase over the years. They've been subject to $87. So every time they see that increase from 87 to 100, 113, 126, they're actually seeing more reimbursement dollars hitting their bottom line. So that's the positive side. That's why so many people that are freestanding or greater than 50 beds, that's why they were on board with this program. The ones that were less than 50 beds that now see these new caps that they never had before, they're the ones that are frustrated and struggling with the whole process. So this freestanding methodology, though, we do believe is going to create some cost report issues for freestandings down the road. I've done a lot of analysis in some other states on freestanding rural health clinic cost reports. And one of the things that I find is that there is a little less detail sometimes put into or focus on what is allowable, not unallowable, and things that we should be seeing as offsets. And the reason that there's been maybe a little bit of a laxness there is, one, the costs that they're calculating per visit are significantly over the old caps. And so since they were significantly over the old caps, there really was no impact reimbursement-wise for them to offset more costs. There was no incentive for the MACs to spend a lot of time analyzing these cost reports and reviewing them and challenging them because they weren't going to find any dollars. Well, some of these things in the area of allowability of costs, I think are going to be a challenge. This is going to be like things like advertising or other non-RHC costs that might be like if they're doing inpatient rounds, if they're doing outpatient services. The other is the identification of ancillary costs. We know that you have to be able to provide lab services. So on every cost report that I see that's a freestanding, I should expect to see that there was some cost related to the lab. There should be an offset for lab. I find a lot of rural health clinic cost reports with no offset of that lab cost. So it's getting baked into their cost per visit. As those costs per visits go up, there's going to be a time where their costs, if there were some disallowances, might bring their actual costs below the new limit. And that's where the MACs are going to start to just challenge things. We anticipate we'll see a much greater focus by the MACs in the future on these freestandings, especially as that rate gets up there. When you start getting up above, the 139, the 152, I do have some RHCs where their actually calculated cost per visit was less than that. They are going to struggle as they start to have people challenging things on the cost report that have been allowed since the beginning of time. They're also going to start to challenge a little bit more, we believe, the calculation of the visit counts. And it's not uncommon, or it hadn't been uncommon for years, for hospital-based to overstate their visits because whoever was giving the visit counts didn't understand the definition of a visit for the cost report. And so these would be not including nurse-only visits, not including hospital inpatient visits, hospital outpatient visits, because the costs have to be carved out also, especially for the inpatient outpatient. The nurse-only visits are ones that the cost just gets baked into the overall all-inclusive rate. But at the end of the day, here's where we're going to see the challenge for freestandings. Is they're going to end up seeing this push to review things on the cost report, and they're going to be frustrated because it's going to be things that, as I noted, have been approved in the past. So lots of things to look at there. If you're freestanding, I'd work with your preparer to say, have we looked at everything on this page to make sure that when it comes time for an audit, that we're fully protected, we're not going to have offsets, we're not going to have surprises. Provider-based RHCs, this is the ones that we believe are going to have the bigger challenges. And that's because their rate isn't going up at the same rate of $13 a visit. Theirs is going to go up by the Medicare Economic Index. And so when it goes up by the Medicare Economic Index, the challenge we run into is Medicare Economic Index is increased by 1% to 2%, typically, historically. And when we look at what our historical costs have increased, they've been increasing at a much greater rate. It's important to note this Medicare Economic Index will apply to that $190 after 2028. So even freestanding entities at that point are going to struggle with that. But when we look at the 2021 to the 2023, and we look at the total increase on average, it was 2.46%. And that 2.46%, that's actually a lot higher than what we saw historically when I said it was 1 to 2, but that's because we got a high inflationary factor in 2023. So there's a lot of concern there. And the other concern that we have is that provider-based RHCs that are in older buildings, their additional reimbursement is limited. If they decide to replenish their plant because of the cap, they're not going to get the extra dollars to help finance that. People that are in newer buildings have that baked into their historical rate. They're in a better position because of the timing. So we're expecting to see, and we're hearing, a huge increase in the focus on direct expenses related to RHCs. Because historically, if I talk to facilities about working on their operational performance in the RHC, the response I would get would be as well, we get cost-based reimbursement. Now we know it's not for everybody. It doesn't include Medicare, non-Medicare. But the fact that it was cost-based, people didn't focus as much time on it. But if your costs are over the new limits, it's not cost-based anymore. For those, it's dollar for dollar. So we're starting to hear a lot of conversation. We're having a lot of strategy meetings with providers to say, what should we be doing different? Or what could we potentially do different? So as an example, one of the things I've seen in the last year, which I hadn't seen on a regular basis for several years. I used to see it 10, 15 years ago when people were just getting into RHCs, but there's a lot of conversations now about how do I move high cost services outside my RHC and then into maybe a provider-based clinic, a freestanding clinic, or an outpatient hospital setting where I can get it outside of that all-inclusive rate. So think about this if you are doing things like high cost injections where there's not a medically necessary face-to-face visit. Well, that just adds to your overall cost per visit in the all-inclusive rate. Well, if we were to move those to another setting, get those out of the RHC, get them out of that, covered but not billable visit, you could actually help try to reduce your costs. So you think about things like Synvisc or Lupron, things like that. There, a lot of people are looking to get out of those. Even a lot of lesion removals. I had a lot of providers that were doing a fair number of like lesion removals, things that take more time. And they started looking at, well, that time means I can't see as many people. And then my cost per visit goes up. I'm actually looking to move that outside. Now that's just a strategy. And I'm not saying it's a good or a bad strategy. I'm just sharing it as an example because I think it's really important to understand patient flow has got to be addressed. Patient access needs to be addressed, satisfaction, reimbursement. You got to look at a lot of things. Dollars and cents is one part, but there's definitely obviously the patient flow, physician satisfaction, patient satisfaction, and all that. Any questions at this point? And by all means, you can put them in the chat if you'd like to. All right, let's move on to this impact of the Medicare Economic Index, because I've had some facilities say, well, if I only get 2% increase every year, my costs are going up by 4%. That's not a whole lot. I mean, yeah, it's not everything, but it's not the end of the world. Well, the problem is that it continues to multiply upon itself. So when we take this here, and I looked at a 10-year run, if we looked at each year, we got a 2% increase, but we got a total of a 4% cost increase. You could see that over 10 years, your costs would go up 48%, but your Medicare Economic Index would only go up 21.9. So now it's not 2% that you're missing. You're actually getting 26.1% below your cost. Now it's a big issue. And that's why it's important for providers to start looking at this earlier than later, start trying to address those challenges about how am I going to keep my costs as much as I possibly can below the new cap. So with that, we're starting to see all kinds of exploring. One of the things I've seen an awful lot of is looking at the mix. As we look at various states and even various clinics within a state, we do see a large variation in the percentage of PAs and NPs and CNMs compared to the total group of providers, including the physicians. And so what we're seeing now is a lot of facilities saying as they change out providers, either somebody retires or they leave the community, there is a much bigger conversation about, can I replace them with the physician if it was a physician that left, or do I need to, because of financial purposes, seriously look at using a PA, an NP, or a certified nurse midwife? What are my options, and how can I make this work? And so a decreasing focus that we're seeing on physicians. And having said that, again, it's not that it's a right or a wrong decision or a conversation. You need to take into account all the clinical needs, the operational needs, and the financial considerations. So maybe maybe you need a certain number of physicians for other things that you have, and that's pushing your drive to keep a higher mix of physicians. But know that this is just one of the strategies that we're seeing play out in the market. So as an example, we had a facility that we were working with. They were impacted by the cost per visit by about $8. They had 9,000 total visits. By total, I mean Medicare and non-Medicare. They're about 40-some% Medicare utilization. The impact of this being over the productivity standard was about 24,000. So through the conversations with the change in provider, they felt they could replace a physician FTE with an advanced practice provider, save about $100,000 in expense. And so by doing that, they're actually, and be able to keep up with the same number of visits. So they felt they could do that all together. So they were able to get under the limit by about $3. So they lost out a little bit on cost reimbursement, but remember, Medicare is the only one that pays on cost. Commercials are paying you on fee schedules. But so they lost about $9,000 by being under the limit, or left $9,000 on the table if they would have spent more. But they netted $91,000 to the bottom line. Saved $100,000, gave up $9,000 in reimbursement, $91,000 to the bottom line, and now they've got a little bit of a cushion, not much, but they're able to get under that cap. So just a strategy that we're seeing there. And here's just an example when I talk about, what we see as far as nurse practitioner and PA FTEs as a percentage of total. That's a standard metric that we look at. And you can see that it varies all over the board. In this scenario, H's are hospital-based, F are freestandings. So you can see anywhere from a low of 20% reliance to almost 100%. So not a right or wrong. All of these entities can provide the services they need to their communities, but definitely a different mentality between different providers. You'll also notice here that the freestandings tended to use a little higher percentage of NPs and PAs versus hospital-based. Not significant, probably like 55 to about 59% difference. So just something to think about and consider as you're looking at strategies as things change in the future. Productivity standards, another thing that we've been seeing in this area. So this is another example that we got to watch on. Productivity standards are out there, and if you get hit by them, it's going to decrease your Medicare reimbursement. Physicians get hit by 4,200 visits per FTE, equates to just a little over 16 visits a day. Now note that not every physician is going to be a full-time FTE. In reality, they're probably going to be a 0.8 at about most, and we'll talk about what they get to carve out. APP is about 2,100 per FTE, so it's a little over 8 visits. Now this is figured in the aggregate, and so that means that if you're short on visits on the physicians but over on APPs, they blend that together and they look at it in the totality. So in reality, what tends to happen is physicians tend to struggle. Physicians tend to struggle to get to that 16 on average in most of the rural health clinics that we operate in. Now, there are all kinds of exceptions out there, ones that don't, but that's just a generalization. APPs typically do not struggle to meet the 2,100 at 8. They tend to be able to beat that. So what we tend to see in most clinics is that the physicians will be short and the APPs do the extra to be able to balance it all out. And so when we see an RHC that's getting hit by the productivity standards, it's more often than not going to be one that has a higher reliance on physicians, lower reliance on APPs. So just something to think about there. Not subject to the productivity standard would be visiting nurse, clinical psychologists, clinical social workers, and locum tenens or physician services under agreement. So, the physicians and the APPs, they're going to be the ones that are going to be subject to this productivity standard. So here's just another example. Had a clinic, the productivity standard for their FTEs was 10,500 visits. Their actual visits were 9,000. So when we look at this here, they actually got hit by 1,500 visits. And so since they were getting hit by those 1,500 visits and their costs were being divided by 10,500 instead of 9,000, they decided to look at replacing a physician with an advanced practice provider, very similar to what we talked about before, saving $100,000. And they were under the cost per visit limit beforehand. The impact on Medicare reimbursement was about $60,000. Now, the interesting piece is the impact on Medicare reimbursement. I mean, think about it. They saved $100,000 and they were able to get 60. So lots of additional dollars that are potential when you look at the analysis. And so when we look at FTEs, this is just another thing to think about here. We get a lot of questions from providers that are saying, my physician is saying that they can't make 4,200, or I've got APPs that say they can't make 2,100, and all of those kind of questions or comments. We've done a lot of analysis on various states, and when you look at it, there is huge swings. Here's an example looking at 5 different clients I just went and pulled up. Anything from 2,240 for a physician. So that one's saying I can't get to the 4,200, but we also have one up at 4,500. You look at the APPs, they kind of follow what I said, that they can typically get past the 2,100, looking at 2,200 up to 3,865. Excuse me. So significant variation. The highest physician visits I've seen per an FTE was a little over 10,000. So, I mean, everything's possible, I guess. Lots of variation. Next, accuracy of cost assignments. This has been an area that we've struggled as we work with providers over the years on trying to get cost delineated between what's an RHC cost versus what needs to be outside the RHC. And so there are certain things that are non-RHC costs that should be taken out of the clinic and moved into the hospital department if you're a provider based. If you're a freestanding, it's something that should come out of the cost report in general. And so the first is the cost for hospital ancillary departments. So this would be lab, radiology, EKG. Those are all diagnostics. Those are separately billable above and beyond if you're freestanding or provider based. But the costs need to be allocated outside. And for hospital based, what we ran into over the years is people like, well, we can't easily identify it. Well, it's cost based in that department. We move it to the other side, it's still cost based. You know, there's just not the focus on it. Well, one, that's a compliance issue. But two, in the future, any additional costs that you leave in the RHC that are above and beyond the cost per visit limit, you're not going to get paid anything. So there is a real need and a purpose to start looking at getting that cost out of there. And so chronic care management is another one that you need to offset by rule. Telehealth, except for the behavioral health ones that you get to do now, those are cost-based. Emergency room availability, any hospital administrative duties, some strategies. You just want to make sure you're getting all those costs out of there, because any costs that stay in the RHC that are above and beyond the cost per visit limit, you're getting $0. You may get some dollars extra by getting them into the hospital, may, not necessarily a guarantee, but you may get some additional dollars depending on your scenario. Cost offsets, and this is again one of the areas I'm concerned about with the freestanding, because I don't see this as much. If you're doing anything for inpatient, outpatient, a lot of this is going back and having to look at your physician agreements or provider agreements and making sure you understand how those costs are being paid, because Medicare auditors will go back to the contract and see if you're paying them differently for different settings and things like that, and try to offset it accordingly. So making sure you understand that offset and making it appropriate. Vaccine costs. You know, when we think about vaccine costs, these are also costs that you get paid 100% of your cost from Medicare outside the cost per visit limit. And so we see a variation, a huge variation in vaccine costs. And so if you have not been paying enough attention to that area and you're not getting all those costs identified and then therefore carved out, you could end up being in a situation where you're over the cost per visit limit and you're not actually capturing all of that reimbursement that you should be collecting. And so you need to understand this RHC versus the vaccination reimbursement, and then understand your Medicare utilization. But I see some entities that, you know, the cost per visit or cost per vaccinations are really low. And a lot of times what that comes down to is this is one of the last forms we get oftentimes when we're preparing cost reports, and it looks really similar to the prior year. So step back and, you know, look at the various components here. You know, how much time are your staff, you know, spending doing a vaccination? Now it's more than just a couple of minutes of popping the vaccination into the patient. They have to document, they have to go get it, they have to get, you know, all the paperwork that they've got to do. They take care of it. They have to, you know, discard and dispose of all the right things. Make sure that whatever you're using for an estimate of time is accurate. You know, if you ask nursing staff, sometimes you'll get the 5 minutes. So it takes me 5 minutes max. Well, I just had my vaccination just recently. I can tell you it takes more than 5 minutes because I actually watched it and kind of try to get an estimate of time. But do that. Make sure you have a good hourly rate, making sure that that's supported by what the real wages are in that department. You're not using the same wages from a long time ago. Make sure you're catching all the costs for the vaccination, for all the supplies, the needles, you know, anything, the syringes, all of that kind of stuff that you need, you know, make sure that you're capturing that, because that's dollars that if you don't capture it, could put you in a position where you're over the cap and you're not getting reimbursed your full dollars. And then visits, make sure that you're not overstating your visits. Now there's two strategies to look at here. First and foremost is we'll talk about this, the rule, and then we'll talk about what this means for your 2020 cost report that you can still go back and look at, as well as what you want to look at in the future. So first and foremost, making sure that you do not include any nurse-only visits. Now, oftentimes when I am talking to the CEO or the CFO, they know that those are not included. If I talk to revenue cycle, they know that they're not billable. But if somebody goes to the receptionist in the clinic and says, tell me the number of visits we had last year, and that's the one that's reporting it in, are they just capturing the face-to-face, the medically necessary face-to-face visits that are an RHC visit? Or are they including nurse only also? Because no one said, don't give me the nurse only. We said, just give me the visits. And so when we start to see this inclusion of extra visits, that means that we calculate a lower cost per visit. And so then we end up getting reimbursed lower. Do not include non-RHC visits. Make sure that they're not including things when they're in the hospital ER or an observation or an inpatient or telehealth, unless it's the behavioral health one, or chronic care management. None of those count as visits. And so we spend a lot of time trying to dig in and make sure that those are not overstated, because those can become 5- and 6-figure digit numbers if you overstate them, especially if you have somebody who does a lot of hospital services, or you got a lot of nurse only visits. So you really want to be careful there to make sure that that's not being overstated. So what do you do here? 2020. If you think that there's a potential that that's overstated, go back and dig into it, work with your cost report preparer and refile that cost report. Do a reopening if you need to, but whatever you do, you want to make sure that 2020 is not overstated. That's the most important year. And that's the most important year because it's the one year that will set that, or does set that new cap, and you live with that forever. So if you understated your cost in that year, you're never gonna get that back. So you want to make sure you check that. Going forward, each year you want to make sure that you capture that correctly, because that's going to impact that current year. But that 2020 is really important to make sure that you worked with your staff to understand that that was not overstated. Allocation overheads, methodologies. Any of our overhead allocations that we have in our organization, if they go over the caps, we're not reimbursed. So we need to use approved methodologies if we want to look at changes. So this is things like, maintenance costs and building costs and housekeeping and laundry and all those things. But we can look at other approved methodologies. And most facilities did this when they first became a critical access hospital, if you're a critical access hospital. They also did this periodically as a change in the organization. But you really want to go step back and look at where your opportunities for change are. And typically they're going to be around depreciation, administrative and general, housekeeping, plant, etc. And then do a reevaluation. If I was to, use new statistics that could be approved by Medicare, could I get a better shake of the dollar coming back to the organization? And if you do, then you can make that request for a change in basis. Again, 90 days prior to the end of the year for which you want to have that change effective, they have 60 days to approve. Now, if you do it that 90 days prior, you still have to have statistics back to the beginning of that year. So your stats would always have to be full year stats, but you do have some grace period into the year as to when you make the actual request. Here's a housekeeping example. So we had a critical access hospital that had a provider-based RHC, and they changed their square footage allocation of housekeeping to time study. And by doing this, and by the way, they were over the limits. And so by doing this, it resulted in less cost being allocated to the RHC and again, that was hit by the cost per visit limit. So they had $35,000 less cost being allocated to the RHC, but it didn't reduce in any reimbursement because they were still hit by the limit. However, that $35,000 that landed somewhere else in the hospital side, the critical access hospital side, resulted in $15,500 or more reimbursement. Remember, this isn't just a one-year thing. This is something that's going to happen every year. So think about, if you do internal allocations, sometimes I see entities try to come up with departmental financials. So they allocate some of the internal allocations like A&G and other things to, the RHC or business office, things like that. You want to make sure that you're not double allocating costs, either through the internal reporting and then on top of the with the overhead allocation. So work with your preparer, make sure they understand it, where you do your business office, where you do your billing, where you do your coding, all of that, because you do have some opportunity to try to make sure you're not over allocating costs to the RHC. So let's talk about some other considerations. So other considerations that we have here, and these are real life scenarios that we ran into. So we had one place where they were looking to build a new RHC. They weren't able to put in their application because the building wasn't that far along. But in this new building now, all of a sudden they were told that they're, instead of getting cost per visit, no cap, they're going to be subject to a cap with a whole brand new building. So they just happened to have another RHC in the same HIPSA, a very small one. It was just open a couple hours a week, 2 days. And so what they've opted to do there is they're looking to close that current RHC location and relocate it within the HIPSA, which would be in that new building. So they're going to relocate that into that area. Now they had to have a current HIPSA to do that because you can't move because it's without a current HIPSA because of address specific rules. But they were able to do that there. Now they'll take that couple of day a week clinic and they could either at some point decide to make it an RHC again, subject to the caps, or just a freestanding. But either way, the net gain between the two clinics is going to be substantial. So they're looking at different strategies. This is a conversation we would have never had prior to the new rules, because we could have opened up a new one without the cap. The other thing is just think about the value of a grandfathered RHC license. If you're ever considering to close an RHC, you really got to step back and think about that, because as a provider based under 50 beds, that's a cap you will never get back. And so we have one entity, they basically had 3 RHCs all under one building because of some old rules and interpretations by the surveyor that required them to have separate licenses. They can go to one license now. And they were very seriously looking to close all the other licenses down to one. And we cautioned them and had the conversation about, well, would you ever look to open another RHC in this HIPSA that's maybe off campus? And the answer was, well, yeah. Well, then do you want to keep one of those other numbers alive and keep running a small RHC that maybe isn't to the best benefit? It's got some extra survey and extra things like that right now. But you have this RHC that has a cap of a few $100s that would be substantially better than a brand new RHC cap. So at this point, they're keeping that extra license alive because they would never be able to buy that again. I've had some facilities talk about divesting an RHC to another organization or affiliate. There's a lot of conversation with that early on. I've not seen one where it made sense to me for them to do that, nor have I seen one that actually went through and followed up with that. I have seen some entities that were looking to become RHCs that didn't meet the deadline for the year end, and they're looking at becoming provider-based clinic initially now. And what I mean by initially is that when they first were looking at it at $113 a visit, that was not going to cover them as well as getting a fee schedule and a cost-based payment in the critical access hospital setting. So they're looking at possibly going provider-based clinic in the early years. But as they get closer to that $190 per visit, it may make sense at that point to actually look at converting over to an RHC. So they'll be watching, where they're at with their HIPSA statuses and everything else to make sure that they look at the short run as well as the long run. Again, lots of different scenarios, lots of different avenues and ways to look at things here. RHC productivity standards, this is just some last things to make sure that we people are doing what they should be looking at here. One is making sure you get the exception for COVID. So as long as we got the PHE, which we have for a little bit longer, make sure that you're taking advantage of getting that request in. This is the easiest way to get an exception that we've ever seen with RHCs. Typically, they're quite difficult, and they don't typically give you all the relief that you would like, but they've been really good about doing it in these scenarios. So if you have not been taking advantage of that, make sure you take advantage of that. That's something working with you and your cost report preparer and Medicare. Noridian makes it really easy. Noridian doesn't make everything always really easy, so this is a good place to look at it. But you know what you should be doing is filing as soon as the data is available, because you can do it before your cost report's filed, so you can get the money right away. The other piece that I'm really concerned about now, because we've been watching these productivity standard waivers, is they've been worth a few $100,000 to many providers. But when they go away, then in that ability to get that exception, you're going to start getting hit by the productivity standards again if you haven't changed your operations, either by replenishing the visits or looking at your practitioner FTEs. So if you've been hit in the past, this is a bigger conversation than what we've had on this topic in other presentations prior to the notification of the end of the PHE. But you are definitely going to want to start looking at how much did that hit me on my last cost report, and have I made changes? Because if I haven't, and the PHE goes away, which it is, I'm going to start getting hit by that. And now you're going to be, hustling to try to change your operations quickly. You have time now, maybe not as much as you'd like, but you have time to start looking at that. File that request if you're going to do a request here. Typically they've done exceptions as a percentage of reduction, although most of the ones under COVID, we've seen them reduce it down to 1 visit per FTE. So we've been able to get basically full exemptions. Some distance site stuff, we know that during the COVID PHE that this is something you get to do. Continue to watch these things. These are things that are going to continue to change. I anticipate we're going to see some more changes on what we can and can't do by the end of May as the PHE starts to come up and wrap up. A couple of other things: COVID vaccines to Medicare Advantage patients. After 1/1 of 2022, they have to be billed to Medicare Advantage. They can't be included on the cost report like they could in the beginning. So make sure you understand that piece. Know that you can get the all-inclusive rate for a provider that's seeing hospice attending services. So that's another new piece to watch there. As of the beginning of 2022, you get the mental health visits furnished real time. You get that all-inclusive rate. So make sure you're following that. There is one other new thing that isn't in place yet, but it is coming in 2024. And I want to make sure that everybody is at least thinking about how that may impact you. Is that effective 1/1 of 2024, marriage and family therapists and mental health counselors will be allowed to have visits in the RHC. They will be covered and a separately billable visit. So this is brand new. This is leading edge, bleeding edge kind of stuff here that you'll want to start thinking about. Would it make sense for us to look at bringing in marriage and family therapists or mental health counselors? We know that a lot of rural providers have been struggling to find behavioral health, mental health kind of providers. Adding 2 types of licensures to the approval list for being a billable provider is substantial. Now we want to make sure that we take advantage of that opportunity if we can find them and make that happen. A couple of things we're going to want to watch is how they're going to handle this on the cost report. So a couple of things that we want to watch on the cost report is right now, everything that I've seen, we're making the assumption that there would be no productivity standards. That would be similar to how they handle social worker visits now, as well as how they handle psychology visits. So a psychologist visit. So you'll want to make sure that you follow that closely, because we don't want to add a service and find out as a surprise that there was a productivity standard that we weren't working to manage. The nice part about this is if you bring these in and you start doing a lot of visits, this might be a way to help try to control your cost per visit also, because the inputs cost should be substantially lower than that of a physician. So we should see some things there. They may not have enough visits to equal all of that benefit, but you might want to look at that. The other thing is that the assumption is that they would get paid the full AIR. So they get the full all-inclusive rate, which would be substantial for the services. So that's a good thing. But again, we just want to keep watching that as they start to lay out the rules, because this was a late last year passing of a rule. We want to make sure that as they propose rules and put things out there, that they're following the intent and the purpose of Congress in that scenario. So let's get down to a summary here. At the end of the day, we really wanted everybody to understand the implications of the caps, understand the timing. That's the piece that I think we've heard a lot about. And then think about those reimbursement implications as they apply to you. Each facility is going to be different if you're freestanding or not freestanding. Your 2020 rate, how high or low that is really going to help substantiate, how much of a potential struggle you may have going forward. Next, start identifying and looking at those operational challenges and opportunities. What can we do to operate different? Do we need to look at service line changes, meaning that we're going to move some of the services we do outside of our RHC? Again, understanding we got to work on the clinical things, patient satisfaction, access, all those kinds of things. Some things we may not be able to move, but we at least need to do our due diligence and our homework to make sure that we're not leaving anything on the table inappropriately. And then looking at that provider mix opportunities. Provider mix opportunities are not going to be things that are going to change overnight. Some of these are going to be conversations that, we don't have any changes in our providers today, but we're at least having the conversations today that when one leaves, we've already had the conversation of how we're going to change. Because if you don't have that conversation ahead of time, as soon as you get notice that somebody's leaving, you don't have time to make the change on that provider, because you're already recruiting and you're already making the decision. Am I looking for a physician? Am I looking for an APP? What am I looking for? How much time do I need? All that there. The other thing I would say in here that we didn't hit on a lot, when you think about just changes of the provider mixes, sometimes just changing the, how much you have as far as an FTE. I have one clinic, they operate with a bunch of 0.8 FTEs. And they get the mix they need to cover their ER and everything else that they wanted to, and they have providers that only wanted to work 4 days a week. Now that won't work in every market. It doesn't work in every market I work with, but it was very ingenious and very effective for that facility. And then explore the cost report considerations. Make sure you got the accuracy of the cost assignment and the offsets. Go back and look at that 2020 visit count. At the same time, make sure that the visit count you have going forward is right. Work with your internally or with your preparer, your cost report preparer. There's lots of them out there that are very capable of doing this. Looking at alternative overhead allocations, making sure that you've chosen the one that makes the most sense for you today, not the one that made the most sense for you when you were pre-caps, because what you had before might have been absolutely right, but it's a different world, it's a different mix. So it's really important to understand, monitor the timing and the reimbursement impact, but really the focus now is we got to look at the operations. And we are seeing a lot of clinics spend a lot of time looking at operational issues. We're seeing them find significant potentials to improve their financial performance by improving processes, decreasing their overall cost per visit, decreasing the amount of resources they need to provide those services. It's the caps have just been the impetus or the push to make that happen. So with that, I know we have a couple of minutes left here. I don't see anything in the chat. Any questions from the audience? All right, with that, Natalie, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so thanks so much for joining us this afternoon, and thanks to Ralph for his wisdom and knowledge sharing with us. And we hope to see you on future Rural Health Clinic webinars. Thank you, everybody.
Have a great day.